Recently, I've fallen back in love with Axis and Allies, which, if you're not familiar with, Axis and Allies is a series of historical strategy board games that focuses mostly on World War II, although there's other versions. There's a World War I version, etc. But they use these little pieces, little tanks, little fighters, little bombers, little infantrymen, ships. Each country on the board will have its own little unique military units represented in these little pieces here. And normally in the game set, in the vanilla standard board game, these game pieces come in one solid color, molded plastic in one solid color, according to the country. So for example, the USA would be green, the Soviets red, the Germans either black or gray, etc. And what I've been doing is I've been painting these little pieces, as you can see here. So the bombers, the fighters, the tanks, the infantry, I've been painting them and giving them a little flavor and adding a little bit of customization. And what I thought was, I'll start something new. I'll start the next step. I'll start on the German ships here, and I'll actually take you step by step through my process, step by step on what I do. And so first thing first, we'll start a new little work area, and we'll take our pieces, we'll lay them out, and the first thing we'll have to do is start to clean them up and smooth out some of the rough edges on these pieces. So looking at these pieces, the first thing we see is that there's a little bit of rough edges, some mold lines, a little bit of burrs that need to be cleaned up. Now the mold line on the battleship, as you can see, is pretty significant. Now what that is the two shells of the mold come together, and where they come together, that's where you get that big mold line. On the aircraft carrier, it's not so bad. The other ships, there's a little one. So there's a little room to clean up these mold lines, clean up these burrs, and make sure the pieces are nice and smooth in your hand. And you do that for a couple of reasons. You want them to feel nice and smooth in your hand. You want the pieces to look good, and you want them to lay flat on the board game, map, so they're not rocking. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take our utility knife, and I'm using a utility knife in this example. You can also use a file, or you can use a hobby knife. And the files I use are these little files on other models, but for this case, I probably won't use this file. Just want to show you what it looks like. But we'll take our utility knife, and we just quickly run the utility knife over the mold lines. Keep working on that mold line, keep working on any rough areas and any burrs, and just clean away the excess plastic. And you just want to get it to a point where it's smooth and flat and feels good in your hand. And so here you can see it's nice and flat and smooth. It doesn't quite look like it because the plastic's been scratched away, but when you run your finger over it, it's very smooth. And once we paint it, it'll look perfectly smooth and flat. So all the burrs have been removed. All the rough areas have been removed. Now next, for any customizations you'll want to be doing on your pieces, for me, I want to add these little magnets into the aircraft carrier. So I saw someone did this, and I thought it was a really cool idea, because in the game you can land 2 fighters on your carrier, and it's a cool idea to have magnets on the fighters and magnets in the carrier, so that they can land nice on the carrier like that, and so they're not falling off when you're moving the pieces around. I thought that was a cool idea, and it's something easy to do, and so I figured I would give it a shot, and if it works this way, you can see how it works as well. So we start by drilling a little pilot hole. I use a little drill bits with a little pin vise, and then we have our bigger bit for the size of the magnet. Start by drilling our pilot hole. Now for the sizes of the drill bits and the sizes of the magnets, I can put that in the description of the video. Additionally, I can add into the description any items I've used, so the glue, the hobby, the utility knife, the magnets, etc. We glue the magnet right on in. First we do a little test fit to make sure that the hole is the correct size, and it is. So then we just use a little toothpick to apply the glue. Next, we primed our pieces. We used Tamiya light gray primer, and then we took Tamiya white paint and we painted flat white over the areas that I'm going to be adding decals. And so I go into detail about adding decals in another video I did, and I can add a link to that in the description as well. But essentially I'm making custom decals, which I'm cutting out here, and the paper backing that I'm using is clear. So if you're using clear decals, you're going to need to apply them onto a white or a very light colored background. So I painted it. You prep the area with primer, and then you can paint it white, and then you can apply the decals. The decals that I'm applying here are little swastikas for the German Navy. These were used historically by the German Navy on their capital ships for aerial identification, but they'll also be used for us in order to actually identify the pieces as belonging to Germany. So otherwise, it's hard to tell which pieces belong to which country. So once the decals are applied, we can begin painting. And I'm using all acrylic paints just because they're very easy to use, very easy to clean up, and that's what I'm used to. And so here I'm applying the German light gray, which is used on all the hulls historically. So we begin by painting over the primer. I can also add in the description every color that I'm using, but we'll begin with the light gray. And generally, my general rule of thumb is to begin with the lighter colors and work your way to the darker colors. And this is for coverage reasons. It's always easier to cover lighter colors with the darker colors, although sometimes that's not possible. So for example, here we'll start with the gray, make sure all the hulls are complete, and then next we'll move on to the wooden deck tan for the horizontal wooden deck surfaces. Now, because these are acrylics, sometimes you might have to go over twice. So for example, here the wooden deck tan, I'll paint one coat and then try to go over it a second time. All of the paint I use for the most part is all Tamiya acrylics, and the reason for that is because I'm just very familiar with how to work with them. As I said, the cleanup is very easy, and I can airbrush with them on my models, and the way that the paints behave is the same for all the colors. So it's just very easy for me to use the exact same type and brand of paint instead of switching up the brands and switching up the types. The other thing to note is that I'm using the pieces from the Axis and Allies revised version, which I believe came out on the 20th anniversary. I believe it's the 2004 edition. So that's important to know because the pieces that I'll be painting and working on here are the battleship, the aircraft carrier, the destroyer, and submarine and transport. I know every version of Axis and Allies, there's a slight difference between versions on which units and which pieces are included. So we can begin by working the wooden deck tan onto all the pieces and We just did our carrier, and so now we're going to be doing our battleships. The battleships, I believe, are molded after the Bismarck class. The Bismarck class, as you'll know, had two ships. It was the Bismarck itself and the sister ship, the Tirpitz. And so what I'll actually try to do is mimic the paint schemes on those two ships. So for example, here I'll start with kind of my interpretation of the Tirpitz camouflage. I think it'll just be something fun to add to the piece, to add a little bit more detail, a little bit more flavor instead of just a bland piece on the board. I think for the capital ships, for the battleships and the aircraft carriers, I'll do a camouflage scheme. And this is not something you have to do, but just to show you, it's not very hard, but it does add a lot of flavor and it adds a lot of detail. But obviously you can see this and maybe you'll have your own ideas. You can do something different. This scheme with the darker grays, it's similar to how the Tirpitz appeared when it was anchored in Norway. Although, of course, we're taking a little bit of artistic license with it. And you can see here the Bismarck and the carrier in Baltic camouflage, which personally I think is probably my favorite camouflage scheme, with the black and white stripes. Now I'll use a toothpick to apply some dark gray to the turret tops, to some of the flat deck surfaces, the metal deck surfaces that weren't the wooden deck. So what I want to show you with the toothpick is I'll use this sometimes if I'm just adding a little bit of paint. It's not a situation where I want to dirty a brush and have to clean the brush. If it's just a little bit of paint, or if I'm just correcting an area, I'll just pull out a toothpick and use the toothpick. You can see here a nice side profile of that Baltic stripe camouflage. I think turned out nice. And then here's our submarine, which I think I'll just keep a light gray and then add a dark gray on the deck surfaces. But something to keep in mind, you don't need to mimic this exact paint scheme. You don't need to mimic every detail that you see here. You can really see this and get ideas on how you want to paint your own pieces. You can easily paint them a solid color and just add small details as you see fit, just to give a little bit more flavor on the board, so it's not just bland colors. Now also what I like to do on the flat bottom parts of the pieces, I'll actually paint the nation color. So in our case, Germany will be black, so I'll paint the whole bottom a flat black. For USA, for example, I'll paint the bottom of the pieces a green. For Russia, I'll paint the bottom of the pieces red, and so on. one thing you'll notice is over time, of course, as you're painting, you're getting a little bit of spillover that'll need to be corrected. So once you're done, generally once I finish painting each color, I can go back and make any corrections. So what's very nice is when you're applying the paint, the nice thing is when you make mistakes, it's very easy to go back and fix. Just grab the other color and you can go back and fix any mistakes. Now the aircraft carrier, of course, we're taking a little bit of artistic license with these because Germany, I don't think, was ever able to complete their aircraft carrier. But I think it would be just a fun idea to mimic the Bismarck and Tirpitz camouflage schemes on them. I think for all the countries, I'm going to generally be trying to stick to a historical paint scheme within reason. Of course, it won't be possible in every case, but within reason, I try to make the pieces look as historical as possible. But of course, the scale we're working in is a very small scale, and at the end of the day, we just need to remember that these are board game pieces. You know, they're for fun, and they're going to be tossed around. So really what you want is just something that looks good and doesn't need to look perfect. And here we can continue to make corrections, and so if it's a small area that needs correction and you either can't fit a brush, or if it's a brush would be too much, you can just use a little toothpick, dab the color on the end of the toothpick, and make corrections as required. And now we are ready for our final clear coat. And I chose to give these a gloss finish, a shiny finish, because at the end of the day, as I said, they're board game pieces, and I think the shiny gloss finish looks nice. And they feel very smooth in your hand with the gloss finish, as opposed to a matte finish, which would be not rough in your hands, but it wouldn't be as smooth. And so here's our finished battleships and aircraft carriers. I think they turned out nice. Here's our finished transport. Our destroyer. And submarine. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed watching me finish these pieces, and I will probably make videos covering all the pieces for each nation.